Thanks. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today at our BCTF Facebook Live webinar. Today we're going to be talking about some of the key issues around education underfunding, and we're going to be exploring not only education underfunding, but also the implications of the recent Supreme Court decision and the potential impacts for class size and composition in our BC public schools. You'll have an opportunity today to post your questions, and I will be able to respond to your questions, and as we go along here and at the end. So let's get started. So one of the key myths that we hear about BC education funding is that it's at record levels. In fact, this is a very common public relations phrase that you'll hear coming from the BC government, that education funding is at record levels. So we're going to explore that myth today. So when we take a look at this chart that you'll see on your screens here, you'll see that on this chart, first of all, let's take a look at the top of the chart, the pencil, and not the eraser component at the bottom, but the top of the chart represents BC public spending. So, and this is education as a percentage of BC public spending from 2000, 2001 to 2016-17. So you can notice the decline that is precipitous decline from that period of time, from 20.4% in 2001. So education comprised just over 1/5 of total public spending, and that's all public spending and public services, down to, by this year, just under 12%. So record level spending doesn't really bear out when we take a look at this, as a percentage of public spending, because that's important. It's not just the total aggregate figure of $5+ billion, because that certainly doesn't account for it as a proportion of public spending, nor inflation, nor other factors. Secondly, on the bottom of this slide here, when we look at the chart here in pink, this is a percentage of gross domestic product, or GDP. And again, looking at this from 2000 to 2016-17, again, a significant decline over that same period, from 3.4% of GDP to 2.2% of GDP. And why we look at GDP as a measure of public spending, or what percentage of public spending factors into GDP, is because GDP gives us a sense of the health of the economy. Essentially, GDP tells us how healthy the economy is, and public spending as relative to that health of the economy. So really that starts to destroy or push through the myth of unaffordability as well. We know that education spending, if it was so unaffordable, we wouldn't see these declines. And certainly it doesn't match up with the rhetoric of BC funding, education funding at record levels. It's been declining as both a percentage of GDP and as a percentage of total government spending over the last 15 years. In sum, BC education, public education funding simply, it has not been a priority of the BC Liberal government over the last 15 years, and it has been declining. Secondly, one of the things that we want to look at in terms of underfunding is not only how BC is doing overall, but also comparatively. How does BC measure up in terms of public education spending relative to other provinces in Canada? It's a great gauge to see where we are in terms of the provinces. As you can see here when we take a look at the chart, from 2001 to 2010-11, we're now seeing a growing gap in terms of per student funding between British Columbia and the national average. In 2001, British Columbia spent about $175 less than the national average in terms of per pupil or per student funding. By 2010-11, that gap had grown to $1,000. Yes. You want me to move back and forward? Sure. Okay. Should I repeat then?
Yeah.
Sure, thanks. Sorry everyone for that. So once again, if we take a look at this slide, you'll see on the far left about $175 less than the national average on per student funding in 2001, 2002. By 2010-11, we have that just $1,000, just under $1,000 less in terms of the national average. So our students in British Columbia, our public education students in British Columbia, are receiving $1,000 less than the national average in Canada. And that's a very significant decline. That's a very significant gap. And as you can see from the chart here, we've had some outlier years where it's been slightly above, or in terms of $8 above in 2005-06. But again, just, again, a trend, as you can see here, a trend toward declining per pupil funding compared to the national average. And when you think about it, I just want you to think about what could our students do with $1,000 more per student. Think about your schools, what that might mean. If you have 250 students in your school or less, what that might mean to have $1,000 extra per student in that school. I think you can probably imagine the kinds of critical impacts and important impacts that could make for each child. Now, another myth that we hear frequently is that, well, okay, funding has declined, but this is mostly driven by enrollment declines. We know in British Columbia that there have been enrollment declines over the past 15 years. This is just shifting demographics. But once again, shifting demographics also mean that in the next 5 years, we're seeing projected enrollment increases. So when we take a look at the statistics, we should see, therefore, that all provinces, we can evaluate what other provinces have done when they have also experienced enrollment declines. So if we take a look at this graph here once again, let's place BC right there in the middle. In the yellow, BC has had an enrollment decline. And we look at a 5-year snapshot because this is part of the Statistics Canada data collection. This is not our data collection. This is Statistics Canada. This is for a 5-year period. We'll see the next 5-year period come out when they release those figures, and that they have not been released yet. So over this 5-year period, BC had 2.4% enrollment decline. And you can see on to the right, other provinces like Quebec and Newfoundland and Nova Scotia had other significant enrollment declines. In fact, only Alberta and Saskatchewan experienced enrollment increases. So next, what we're going to want to take a look at then is, what do these provinces do with respect to the hiring of educators? So when we take a look at a comparison, only British Columbia did not hire more educators. Despite enrollment declines in every other province, with the exception of Alberta and Saskatchewan, all other provinces hired more educators. So again, that just really begins to push back against the myth that somehow enrollment declines should be singularly driving funding declines. It doesn't match up. There are other things to fund in terms of our schools besides children being in the classrooms. There are capital costs, there are salary costs, there are materials costs, etc., that we need to factor in when we think about education funding as a whole. So enrollment declines are not driving education funding decreases. Other things, ideologies, political decision making, etc., are driving those decreases. And that's something really important to think about because it is a political decision. So, what are the impacts in terms of public education with respect to our classrooms, with respect to our buildings, our teaching staff, etc.? We're going to cover some of these in this presentation, and we're going to give you, of course, a chance to ask questions about these. One of the first impacts is we're going to be looking at declining numbers of classroom teachers. We're also going to be looking at declining specialist teachers and specialist services. And this includes your teacher librarians, it includes your English language learner teachers, your teacher counselors, and so forth. These are your specialist teachers who have highly specialized knowledge and training to be able to deliver specialized services to children who need those services. Increased class sizes and complexities. We're going to present the data on this and also discuss some of the impacts. And inadequate supports for children with special needs and children who are English language learners. Again, because of the declines, the cuts to education funding in British Columbia over the past 15 years, there have been significant and serious impacts on children who have exceptional and special needs and who are English language learners, etc. And then fundamentally, how this affects the pressures towards privatization and the impacts that it's been having with respect to growing private school funding in British Columbia. While education underfunding has been occurring significantly, as we're showing here, in the public school system, the private school system has not been experiencing the same types of underfunding. In fact, private school funding, as we'll show, has grown very significantly. And then, of course, looking at our schools, we're going to look at capital infrastructure issues, including lead, asbestos, radon, and seismic concerns. So first, we're going to take a look at the loss of BC teaching positions that are classroom-based positions and specialist positions. In total, we have lost over 3,500 teaching positions within a 15-year period. that includes a loss of over 1,600 specialist teaching positions. So specifically, we're going to look at our specialist teaching positions. In the left-hand column of your table here, you'll see that these are the declines in FTE teachers. Go back again?
Yeah, unfortunately.
Okay, no problem.
I'm still on the last slide of your...
Okay, we're having just a technical glitch here. Just give us a second. Is it on the slide?
No, okay,
What do you see on your slide, Margaret?
I have reality BC has lots of...
Yes. Great.
Sorry about that.
No worries. So again, just looking at your left hand of your table here, these are your specialist teaching positions, your English language learner teachers, Aboriginal education teachers, special education teachers and teacher librarians, and there's also teacher counselors as well. That's not included in our chart, but I'll talk about that in a second. English language teachers, there has been a 33% decline, almost a 34% decline in English language learner teachers, minus 1% Aboriginal education, minus 19% special education, and teacher librarians at minus 30%. But then when we take a look at student enrollment, once again matching that kind of the changes in enrollment and how enrollment again is not driving decision making around our teaching positions, we see on the right hand side of this table here that all of these head counts, all of these enrollment counts have been increasing. So we have more children that have specialized needs for specialized services, but again, at the same time, during this 15-year period, we have been seeing a precipitous decline in our specialist teaching positions. Once again, this impresses upon us that these education funding decisions and education teaching positions, the decision-making around these positions has not been driven by enrollment changes, but rather by political decision-making. So looking at the impacts on classrooms and class sizes, you can see here that BC has the second worst educator to student ratio in Canada. We have 17 students per educator, where it's nationally 14 students per educator. In terms of your classrooms, as parents, as teachers, as members of the community, you'll see that we just have fewer and fewer teachers who are able to support children's needs within the classroom, whether they are specialist teaching needs or classroom needs. Our class sizes have been growing, and we have fewer teachers to be able to support these children in our classrooms. Looking at our specialist teachers again, just looking at the ratios, and this is just looking at the number of teacher librarians, for example, with respect to the number for every teacher librarian, to the number of students. So, in 2007, 2008, less than a decade ago, we had 746 teacher librarians, or pardon me, that would be nice. We have 746 students for every teacher librarian. Within less than a decade, that grew to 961. So this is, and when you think about that, 960 students for one teacher librarian. This is a province where we should be valuing literacy, and our teachers value literacy, but in order to deliver these important programs and services, we need teacher librarians in our schools to be able to fulfill these important services. And with ratios this high, it simply can't be done. And we need to think about going forward how we're going to be able to change this. And we're going to talk about how the Supreme Court of Canada decisions changes that in a few minutes. Looking at our class sizes and complexities. One of the things that the Supreme Court of Canada decision had an impact on is going to be upon restoring the collective agreement language around class composition. This includes the number of children in a classroom that have individualized education plans. And these are children with special needs that range from various types of needs. One of the reasons that we think about this is that it's important that we were able to, as teachers, as representing teachers, to drive supports and services to children who have exceptional needs, who have special needs, and to be able to do so, to provide the right supports and services for kids. Over the last decade, this is from 2005 to 2015-16, the number of classes that have 4 or more students with IEPs has grown by 50%. So we now have more and more classes that have high numbers of students with special needs. And to be able to deliver those supports and services with special needs, when we think about just going back a few slides with the declines in the number of specialist teachers, you begin to put that picture together how complex and how challenging that is to be able to deliver these specialized supports and services when we have higher numbers of children with special needs per classroom. At the same time, we have declining numbers of specialist teachers. It's an impossible scenario, and it needs to be addressed going forward so that we can provide meaningful inclusion to children with special needs and to provide meaningful education for all children. So when we're looking at this chart here, this is just giving us a picture of the complexity of our special needs within our classrooms and within our schools in British Columbia. Over the past 15 years, the number of funded special needs students has increased by 54%, while at the same time the number of special education teachers total has decreased by 24%. So this chart here represents the number of funded special needs students, over 26,000. And I say funded because what that is our children who are low incidence, high needs children that have more severe or significant special needs within the classroom. And low incidence students require a higher degree of supports and services within our classrooms. And therefore, this is something that we want to think about with respect to restoring supports and services to our classrooms to begin to address the complexities of our special needs students within BC's public schools. And as I said earlier, we were going to talk about as well looking at the pressures of privatization. When we think overall in terms of education underfunding, I don't think it should come as any surprise that we are seeing growing pressures towards privatization, growing pressures towards enrolling children in private schools. When our public schools are unable to fulfill a meaningful education, an appropriate and supportive education for all children, the pressures on parents to seek alternatives is significant, particularly when we look at some of the voucher systems that have developed in British Columbia, and I'll get into that in a minute. But the reality is that when you are stripping away supports and services and teachers, you're growing class sizes, you're growing class complexities, and you're not providing the attendant supports and services and materials that children require, then the pressures on privatization are significant. The pressures towards privatization, for parents to remove their kids to seek private alternatives is significant. And it's particularly so, as we can see here from this chart, for children with special needs. This is something that has really come to light, which is that we had this critical mass of children who are being removed from the public school system to private schools. So in this chart here, you can see that in 2010, just 5 years ago, we had 2,279 children who were enrolled in BC's independent or private schools. That number has climbed within a 5-year period to 6263. And so this is a very significant increase over a very short period of time. And again, the pressures, if you have a child with special needs, I have a child with special needs, quite significant special needs. And when you are in a system where it's underfunded, where there is a lack of specialized supports and services, including specialist teaching positions, it's not surprising to wonder why parents are making the decision to remove their children. And the only way to address this is to infuse funding back into the education system, to return those teachers and the specialist teaching positions, to return the supports and services that were stripped over 15 years ago. That's the only way to provide meaningful and supportive education so that we can see this trend reversed.
Hey, this is Rich following along on... Yeah, we're just asking a question from Facebook, Sherri, if you don't mind. This is Rich following along on the comments. Tamara is curious to know what the number of students with an IEP in BC is like compared to the rest of Canada, if you have any information on that.
In terms of the total numbers of students with
Numbers
IEP?
of students and the numbers of support and the levels of support and any insights on that.
We don't have data on students with IEP from other provinces. That's a really great question in terms of comparatively. We know that of our total student population in public schools in British Columbia, about just a little over 10.6% of students have an individualized education plan or have what we call a designation, a special needs designation. So it's just a little over 10.5%. So it would be interesting, I think Tamara's giving me some work to do, in terms of finding out other provinces what that percentage is like. But that's a fairly standard percentage in most districts, across most jurisdictions, somewhere between 8 and 12% of the population can be expected to have a special needs designation. Thank you. So this is a 175% increase in 5 years. And when we see a trend, as a statistician, when I see a trend of 175% increase in 5 years, we know this is not a normal rate of growth. This is not an expected rate of growth for any kind of expected public service or transition to a private service. This is an exceptional transition. So again, thinking about that, thinking about how we begin to address this through both the restoration of our collective agreement language, which I'll talk about very shortly, as well as changing the character, the feel of schools so that we can begin to, again, put those supports and services in place so that we can provide meaningful inclusion for children with special needs, and to provide that kind of support so that we can have inclusion where children, both with special needs and without, are meaningfully benefiting from our public education system. And just following up on the last slide, it's worthy to note, it's important to note that actually when we think about the enrollment into private schools, we're not talking here about enrollment into brick and mortar or traditional brick and mortar private schools. The majority of children who are exiting the public education system to go to special education children who are with special education needs, exiting the public school system, are going into distributed learning programs, which are home-based online programs that are delivered primarily by a certified BC teacher, but within an online distributed format, meaning that it's home-based. And if you take a look at this, yep, right slide, okay. If you take a look at this chart here, you'll see that in 2010, again, just 5 years ago, that the special education grants, distributed learning grants, were at about $7.5 million annually. By 2014-15, this had climbed to 21.9 million, just over 21.9 million. No, it's okay. We'll just check in on the slide here.
Yeah, this last slide, I kind of really unfortunately, so that's the one. Yeah, that's the one.
I think I might have lost your screen sharing.
Just give us a second here, folks.
Yeah, I'm going to put a camera on you.
Oh.
Okay, there we go.
Is the slides back up?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Panic. It's all good. Okay, so once again, just to go back to what I was trying to cover here, was the idea that most of these are home-based programs. They're online programs. And again, we see a 191% increase in distributed learning and home-based programs. When I see this statistic, when I think about a nearly 200% increase in the grants to distributed learning schools, this tells me a few things. Of course, it matches up with the previous slide in terms of enrollment or the exodus of special education, children with special education needs that are going to a distributed learning private school. But it also tells me that those children are not going to schools where they have peer interaction. They're going, and they may have peer interaction through various other mechanisms, but it's primarily a home-based program. So it's also a program that not only takes a child out of a public school, but also takes a parent back into the home as well. So a parent, for example, as a special needs parent, if I was to take my child into a distributed learning program, I wouldn't be sitting here. I would be at my home overseeing the program, because these distributed learning programs, for the most part, ensure that a parent is present, of course, when the program is being delivered either by the parent, by a therapist, an educational assistant, and so forth. So it not only takes a child out of the education system or public education system, but it also requires that a parent, if they were gainfully employed, are going to be back into the home. And that changes the dynamics of family income, of employment, of all different kinds of factors. That's something to think about. And it's a really important decision. And personally, I know a lot of parents who have made this decision, and we know where these decisions emanate from. It's a dissatisfaction with the level of support and services within public schools. It's a lack of access to specialist teachers. It's a lack of access to the types of supports that are so critical for kids to obtain. But when I mentioned about the voucher system, one thing I really want to mention here, why parents again are making this decision to do this, is because when you transfer your child out of a public school, you actually take with them to a private school, if they have a special need, you take with them both their basic allocation grant, which is something that all children in the province who are in public schools get. It's a basic allocation grant, plus a supplemental grant for special education, so which is in effect de facto a voucher system. And these voucher systems we see in other jurisdictions, but it's rare to see these in Canada. Only 5 of our 10 Canadian provinces have provide public subsidies for private education. This is not widespread. This is certainly not widespread in the United States. They have different mechanisms of funding private education, and they don't rely on public subsidies to the extent that we do here in Canada. And so the voucher system that's been set up, particularly for children with special needs, is something that, again, we really need to think about. Because, again, it doesn't just take a child out of public education, it changes the family dynamics as well. So that's something that we need to think about, and hopefully, again, once we get to the discussion about the restoration of our supports and services and our teachers into classrooms, hopefully this will begin to address these, in part address these concerns and issues, and hopefully reverse these trends. So fundamentally overall, not just distributed learning, but looking at the growth in public and independent schools funding over a decade, just a little over a decade, you see here on the right of the graph that independent school funding has grown by 92% over a 11-year period, while at the same time public school funding has grown by only a little over 19%. And this inequity is driven in part by enrollment changes, but it is also fundamentally, as I said earlier, driven by political decision-making about subsidizing private schools, about the development of a voucher system, about underfunding public education, about stripping teachers and teaching positions from our education system, and about changing budgets around, or funding around supports, services, materials, capital, infrastructure, etc. And fundamentally, despite the fact that these political decisions are in place, we know that the majority of British Columbians oppose government subsidy to private schools. A recent poll said that 77% of British Columbians say that they oppose government subsidy to private schools. So something to think about, particularly as we head into an election, and in fact, in over 2 months from, not even over 2 months from now, exactly 2 months from today, on May 9th, where again, British Columbians who don't favor government subsidy for private schools, we have to ask all our parties, why are we continuing to fund, why are we continuing to subsidize private education? There is absolutely no legal requirement for the British Columbian government to subsidize private schools. The statutory obligation or the legal obligation for education is that the government of British Columbia must fund a universal and accessible quality public education system. That is the first priority, and it ends there. Any further subsidy to private education is, again, a political decision. And it's one that, of course, as you can see here, the majority of British Columbians do not favor. So hopefully this will factor into our vote and our considerations on May 9th. Moving on to looking at capital issues. Many of you who have children in the public education system will be able to provide all the data that I need for this. We'll be able to discuss crumbling schools. We'll be able to discuss schools that have not been adequately seismically upgraded. Many of you may have schools, if you take a look at the list, where that your children are attending high-risk seismic schools that have yet to be upgraded. Perhaps some of you have children where there have been reports of lead in the water in schools. We know that these reports they're coming on an almost weekly basis around some of the serious concerns around the failure to both adequately upgrade our capital and our infrastructure in BC's public education schools, as well as to build new schools, to facilities plan to ensure that there's adequate space. When I think about Surrey, School District 36, and the tremendous growth that Surrey has experienced in terms of enrollment increases, and all you need to do is drive out around Surrey and take a look at some of what I call the portable cities, where you see multiple portables on the grounds of schools, and how that is impacting the growth of schools in Surrey, how that's impacting children within those schools themselves. Those are serious concerns that need to be addressed, in addition to very serious concerns around seismic issues, around the radon, around the abatement of asbestos and the treatment of asbestos, how we remove asbestos from schools that need to have asbestos removal and abatements, seismic upgrades, etc., overcrowding of schools. I'm conducting this webinar from Vancouver, where we have many schools that are very overcrowded, and there was discussions to close schools, despite the fact that we have serious overcrowding of schools. The school that my child attends is nearly 150% over capacity. So if you're a parent, or if you're a teacher or a community member, and you're entering these schools, you have a sense immediately that many of them are overcrowded. And these are things that we need to think about, or the government particularly is the one that needs to think about, how to address these serious capital and infrastructural issues going forward, and to have a facilities plan that looks at demographic projections, that looks at student needs, that looks at the kinds of facilities planning that's going to be critical to making sure that we can have adequate class sizes and compositions within BC's public schools, and to address the very serious capital issues around seismic upgrading, lead, radon, etc. Oh, sorry, that slide's misplaced there. And now, sorry, I'm skipping around here a little bit, and I apologize for that. But just to, again, when we think about our capital issues and we think about our public education system, we shouldn't see things like $358 million going to independent schools, and something like this, where BC gave $358 million to private schools, including those for the super elite, at the same time threatening to force schools like Osoyoos High School, Osoyoos Secondary School, because of government underfunding. We have closed over 257 schools since 2002, and the British Columbian government the Liberal government has closed 257 schools over the past 15 years, while at the same time buttressing private schools and elite private schools. So this kind of discrepancy, again, voters and constituents and members of the public and BC teachers, we need to be thinking about as we approach the May 9th election, and we need to be advocating to be able to properly care for, restore, replace, fix any of the capital and infrastructural issues within British Columbia, and to really strongly come out discussing the issue of public subsidies for private schools. Now, getting to the important issue, many of you will have heard that on November 10th, 2016, the Supreme Court of Canada rendered a decision from the bench that deemed that the actions of Bill 27 and Bill 28, the Christy Clark, that was first brought in under Education Minister and now Premier Christy Clark in 2002, that these decisions were illegal, that the stripping of the collective agreement language on class size and composition were deemed illegal, and that they would agree with the dissent, which was provided by Justice Donald, and that ultimately what this meant, well, it's going to have implications for the restoration of class sizes and composition language and specialist teaching positions, but it will not address all of the issues of underfunding in British Columbia. So while we now have an agreement in principle in committee that is going to be voted on by the BCTF membership, which will restore class size and composition ratios across our 60 school districts where that language exists, we are going to see an influx back into the classrooms, and many of you will have heard of the interim decision to put $50 million back into public education for the restoration of teaching positions. That is going to be developed even further into this new agreement. So we can expect to see a significant return of our teachers and our specialist teachers into classrooms, as well as significantly the reduction of class sizes and changes to class composition in our public schools. This is going to be really significant. It's going to be huge for the level of support and services that we can provide to BC's public school students, as well as to be changing some of the working conditions for teachers that have been asked to do more and more with less and less. And that's going to be really significant as we move forward into restoring this language. But as I said, one of the things to really think about as we move forward, particularly as we move forward to May 9th and 2 months from now, what the impacts are going to have with respect to all of the non-teaching position and all of the non-class size and composition issues. And I'm just going to sort of overview these here. So, as I discussed earlier around class capital infrastructure needs. I didn't talk about this, but around hygiene, around cleanliness of our schools, around building schools, restoring schools. If schools need replacement of infrastructure or repair of infrastructure, the provision of teaching materials, all of these tangible materials and tangible capital needs and infrastructural needs, this is not going to be met by the restoration of the class composition and class size language that was stripped from the collective agreements in 2002. Unfortunately, this is going to require sustained advocacy by BCTF members, by our community, by parents, by our groups that are our public education and advocacy groups. None of these issues will be addressed by this language. And the budget that came out that was most recently released in 2017 by the BC Liberal government does not address these adequately as well. Already districts are reporting expected shortfalls for the 2017-2018 school year. And so once again, we are continuing to underfund education. The only reason that we are going to be seeing the restoration of teaching positions, specialist teaching positions, class size and composition limits is because of the sustained advocacy and legal battles that were waged by our membership and by the BCTF to undo the illegal actions of the stripping of this collective bargaining language that the Christy Clark Education Minister and now Premier engaged in 2002. That was changed by advocacy. So we can change these types of issues by advocacy as well, but it's going to require a concerted effort by all parties, parents, teachers, the community. We can expect, of course, thankfully, teachers are optimistic, hopeful, excited that we can expect changes to crowded and complex classrooms. I've spoken with many of our teachers who are so excited for the first time in 15 years for those who were teaching before this language was stripped illegally by the Clark government in 2002. But they are hopeful, they are excited that we are going to see new learning assistance teachers, English language learner teachers, teacher librarians. Some districts don't even have a single teacher librarian on staff. We will now see the restoration of these ratios, teacher librarian ratios, English language learners, special education teachers, etc., coming back into our schools where the districts are now hiring teachers en masse to be able to fulfill these teaching positions so that we can have extra supports and services, extra persons working with your children every day to provide those extra supports. That's important. I've spoken to teachers who have talked to me about the fact that when they were teaching before 2002, that they would have a learning assistance teacher come into their room and support children that needed reading recovery groups or provided hands-on supports for other classroom planning or classroom types of exercises or activities. An English language teacher coming in to provide support for that child who is learning the English language and needs extra support to be able to have a meaningful education, to access the general education. They need that English language learner teacher to provide those critical supports. They need the special education teacher to be able to both navigate the system in terms of accessing supports and services and resources and materials, but also where necessary to provide extra additional one-to-one support or group support. And then smaller class sizes. You're going to have less children in a classroom, which is going to mean more one-to-one attention from teachers. It's going to mean less children overcrowding that classroom. It's going to mean more hands-on time with teachers. It's going to be much more meaningful for our kids. It's a very exciting time, and this is huge. And I don't want to understate or fail to deliver on the really important significance that this has for your children in terms of the class sizes, compositions, the one-to-one contact, the group contact with specialist teachers, with classroom teachers, etc. So we're really looking forward to seeing some of these important impacts that will be rolling out now and into next September as well. But non-teaching supports and supplies for students, including students with special needs. I was recently at a conference where a parent said to me, I'm on a wait list to get an FM system for my child who is deaf and was deaf and hard of hearing. And that's really important. Our children with special needs, my child with special needs, your children with special needs, need not only teaching supports, but also they need resource supports and material supports. They need an FM system if they need to be able to hear what the teacher is delivering. All of these things are ancillary but fundamental to how our children learn in a classroom. And there's nothing in the budget there. There's nothing in the budget to amplify, to strengthen our critical programs and services that children need to help support their learning, whether they have exceptional needs or not. So these types of things like psycho-ed assessments and wait lists and wait times, supports from the government around for poverty and around supporting children who have needs that have poverty-related needs or have needs with English language learning around materials, etc. Those kinds of things will not be delivered by this budget. And they're not going to be, unfortunately, they're not delivered as part of the package around restoration of our language that was stripped. The non-tangible, or the material needs, particularly, are not going to be delivered by this. And the advocacy to be able to improve the funding, to improve the budgeting from the provincial government to our districts, to our classrooms is going to be essential. Again, unfortunately, no to the non-teaching workload drivers. Again, the budget did not deliver a new line of infusion of supports to be able to provide extra professional learning for teachers. We see that there's a standard issue of what we call non-instructional time, but there's nothing additional to be able to support our teachers in learning the new curriculum, applying the new curriculum, developing materials and lesson plans and classroom planning around the new curriculum. We have this wonderful new curriculum that's come into place, but again, nothing is in place there that's exceptional for professional learning. Nothing in place there exceptional for curriculum change, other than what amounts to about $50 per student for classroom supplies, and $50 per student for coding. I'm not sure how I could learn coding on $50, but we'll see, I suppose. But in terms of reporting requirements as well, there's new changes that are taking place. Technology is an amazing and wonderful thing, and we're coming to you via technology. But again, technology in terms of different reporting requirements, we have new technologies for reporting, we have new technologies for assessment, we have new technologies for delivering learning in the classroom. And again, there's no money in the budget for this to be able to train teachers, to be able to provide in-service training and mentorship opportunities for teachers. We don't see additional funding in that budget for teachers. And for teacher guilt, we have run here at the Federation, we have run a series of interviews, focus groups, surveys to try to assess and understand the complex learning conditions and working conditions that teachers have been facing over the past 15 years. And our teachers go into the teaching profession for the reasons that you can expect. They love to teach children, they love working with children, there's a joy, there's a value, there's a reward of being able to support children with all learning needs and profiles to be able to reach their best potential. But teachers who have been teaching in a climate of severe and persistent underfunding, coupled with a government that conducted an illegal stripping of the language and unfortunately pitted our teachers against the public, we have this increasing rates of guilt, demoralization, mental and emotional health and well-being challenges. Existing in this climate, unless you're a teacher, I think it would be hard to imagine what that might be like. And our teachers are reporting they are committed as ever to do this job, but there have been significant effects of teaching in a climate of severe and underfunding. Very similar to, I'm sure, to what many of our healthcare professionals are experiencing with the stripping of the healthcare budgets and health underfunding. When you exist and do your job where you are provided with fewer and fewer supports and resources, and those are being stripped and cut left, right, and center, you can imagine that it takes a huge toll on our teachers. Teachers are still committed. Teachers are still excited and optimistic about the future going forward in terms of particularly around the restoration of the language and the funding that came, because we're going to need to fund up to 3,000 or more new specialists and classroom teachers, and that's going to be significant. But the legacy of 15 years of underfunding is going to be one that's going to take time to undo. It's going to take time to tell teachers, to show teachers, and to show parents and community members that you can expect more when we have those supports and services in place. When the learning assistance teacher returns to the classroom to provide supports and services for children who need it, to provide that English language learner teacher, to have the teacher librarian who's going to have kids in their library doing work on literacy and reading and all kinds of explorations there. That's going to be important, but it's going to take time to undo this legacy. So that is the conclusion of some of the key messages, the key themes and data around the underfunding of BC's public education system. And just to kind of, again, I'm going to I'll go back here and just to sort of sum up some of the key messages that we want to take a look at here in terms of the impacts. Once again, this is what the impacts have been over the last 15 years. We can expect changes to take place through the restoration of of the collective agreement provisions that are going to restore specialist teachers as well as classroom teachers. But this is the legacy. So let's think about that as we get to May 9th. Let's think about that as we're parents trying to engage in advocacy, joining your local PAC, your DPAC, parent advocacy network, FACE, etc. There are a number of different public education advocacy groups out there that you can join to lend your voice, to lend your efforts to advocacy for public education, and we are grateful to these groups. We are grateful to our teachers who have, for 15 plus years, who have fought to support our students, to restore the conditions for supports and services into our classrooms, to make sure class sizes remain manageable, and to be able to provide better public education, quality publication to all of our students. So thank you.
Only one. I'll turn on my mic, Margaret.
I have one question here.
Just a comment is that from Mike in Vancouver about the Vancouver School Board and others still projecting that they may have deficits this year, and even with all the new funding announced by the government, why deficits are still to be expected and what folks can do about it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. As I think I mentioned earlier in the presentation here that a number of districts are already projecting deficits for 2017, 2018. And the reason for that is because, again, all of this picture in terms of underfunding is not going to be addressed by by the infusion of funding that has been specifically dedicated for the restoration of specialist teachers, and classroom teachers. So underfunding continues to persist in our programs and services. It continues to persist with respect to capital infrastructure needs. There are a number of unfunded, what we call unfunded cost pressures that are downloaded onto school districts that the government does not provide funding for. And that includes things like salary increases from both support staff and teachers or administrators. It includes MSP premiums or medical services plan premiums that are paid for by the employers, the districts. That includes inflation costs, the inflationary costs of our supplies, our materials, etc. That includes costs around the next generation network, all different types of unfunded cost pressures that you won't see budget line items for. So when you don't see a budget line item for operational spending with respect to MSP premiums or salary increases, it doesn't exist, and therefore the districts must find a way to cover the costs of those costs and pressures, which results in deficits. Because once again, we have this per pupil student funding model that again does not account for many of these cost pressures, and it's certainly we have a growing, as I said earlier, we have a growing complexity of students. We have students that are coming from various socioeconomic backgrounds, profiles, needs, etc. And if we don't adequately fund those, then we're going to see deficits. And we're going to see deficits when the government also, again, continues to make cuts to education in all of these different areas.
Great. Well, just one final comment for you, and this is from Heidi. Thank you, Dr. Brown, for such a comprehensive presentation. Every BC voter needs to see this before May 9th.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you so much. I really appreciate everybody participating today. Thanks so much.